a trip.
Theoretically, we put the RJ's Evolution Hour thing up with just a freeze frame, and I can go in honor of Psy Strike, and I won't inflict that on you any longer. I call attention to the www.patreon.com at the bottom, a place where people can become sustaining supporters of the #TIP project. Hint, hint. Now I will stop sharing and we will get on to what's important, which is the discussion of things. This is Evolution Hour, where I put up a topic of, oh, I see Justin Liebach just in waves, I wave back. A topic that is both topical and historical, which is the relationship between science and politics and culture and religion, and how if you think you can avoid those third rails, well, get a grip, you can't. I thought I'd bring up a deep thing of why science developed at all. It's not something human beings do naturally, and it took quite a peculiar circumstance to originate. One of the big issues that always came up in the history of science was why did it develop in the Western world and not elsewhere, and particularly why it didn't develop in China. And when you understand more about the Chinese culture and the brakes that they put on independent inquiry, it's kind of understandable. Ironically enough, there's a guy named Stark and a few others that have been playing this card, who have been arguing that science developed in the Christian world because Christianity is inherently pro-science and all that, and I go, bullpucky. There is an element about it which has a grain of truth, and it was accidental. That Christian thinking had a conception of God as a craftsman, as a handymaker. And in the medieval world, you would see impressions of God scribing out the universe, like with a compass and straight edge, like an architect. And that notion that it was okay to look at the pieces of God's handiwork to understand more about the glory of the Creator was something that was a kind of Christian concept. And it isn't what was going on in China. The Taoists, who were the main people who were doing what we would call proto-science, they were kind of like alchemists and magical thinkers, had one big break in their thinking, and that was they didn't imagine you could take the pieces apart and learn anything, that you had to appreciate it as a Tao, as a totality. That's why they never really developed the kind of experimental science that you ended up with. Plus, Neo-Confucianism came in as an ideological dogma. That's where the politics comes in. That basically said the only thing that matters is that you know the Confucian classics. If you can comment intelligibly on the Confucian dogmas, then you were okay. Everything else was irrelevant. And it meant that the Song dynasty in China, which is like 8th century or so AD, at that point, the Chinese were the most sophisticated culture on the planet. They were on the verge of developing market capitalism. They had a money economy. They had the roots of logarithmic slide rules. They had working out gas lighting and coal technology. And I mean, it's just astonishing the number of things they were doing in China. They were so far ahead of the Europeans, it just screams. Of a few centuries, they managed to stultify themselves, petrified themselves to the point when it was the Europeans sailing in their boats that used Chinese rudders and Chinese compasses and Chinese gunpowder, and they're telling the Chinese what they're supposed to be doing. And so they were that far behind the curve. So this stuff kind of matters. Now, why did science then develop more specifically in the European culture? And that's a fascinating, complex story. One thing we can be sure of, it wasn't automatically because they were Christian. Because if you look at what was going on in the Byzantine Empire and the cultural frames there, there was no surge to scientific thinking over in that department particularly. It was occurring accidentally in areas. Florence and other areas, there were the 12th century medieval silver technology that was developing, where they worked out pumping technology and control mechanisms that would eventually lead to clocks and printing presses and a whole bunch of stuff. If you want to get a big grip on a lot of this, you can check out James Burke's Classic Connections series, which he did a bunch of them for the BBC back in the 70s and 80s. And he loved to point out all the deep roots of science and technology, and the origin of science was one of the problems that he dealt with in that context. It's fair to say that scientific thinking was developing more in the Protestant world than in the Catholic world, although it didn't start out that way. And we have to look at that little missing piece, which fills in a hole, and that was what was going on and eventually didn't in the Islamic world. The Islamic world was at one time, if you were looking at 1100 or so, they were in the forefront of experimental science with optics and a lot of things. But they also lived in a world where the Quran thought the world was the center of the universe and didn't move. And there was only so far that you could push Aristotelian science and experimentalism before you bumped into the third rail of where science bumps into politics. Science, if it's a free inquiry, what happens if it starts discovering stuff that the authorities or the religion says isn't true? And the various persecutions of people over time. Giordano Bruno is an awkward case, although he popped up in the Connections, or the New Cosmos series that deGrasse Tyson did, because he's at best a proto-scientist. But when you get down to Galileo's time, where you've got this son of a bitch, arrogant bastard Galileo, who's insisting on basically rubbing his nose in the Pope about heliocentrism and rubbing everybody the wrong way, still, the church had the power to put you under inquisition. It had the power to ban your books. It had the power to make your life miserable and force you under house arrest. Even if it didn't end up killing Galileo, nonetheless, it had the power to really put the brakes on things. Over in Protestant land, you had a different concept. And it's revealing that in places that were bristling with a dislike of external authority, like in Holland, that was one of the places where optics and a lot of physicists and Leibniz and a whole bunch of other people were developing a lot of the roots of modern science, even when some of the conventional monarchies in France and even in England were kind of looking down their nose at some of the science. Things picked up steam even more as we get into the 18th and into the 19th century, because now we're into the era of revolutions. And the French Revolution acted as big a divide as the Russian Revolution did in the 20th century for scaring the shit out of people. So you had a thing, it broke up the friendship for years between Thomas Jefferson and Adams because they took different sides on the French Revolution. A lot of the new geology was being balked at in places around in England and other places because a lot of it was being fomented by those French revolutionists over on the other side of the pond. And so the age of the earth got tossed up into this, and then you toss in evolution that happens in the 19th century. So people start fighting proxy wars in culture, using the science as the weapon. And we're getting exactly that today with the climate change issue, where this is part of a culture camp conservative cultural frame that then takes on, they're talking about temperature and polar bears, but it's really about issues of what is social stability and what are the people on the political opposition or the people that don't like your religion doing, and it gets mixed up in that. You find that with Dinesh D'Souza, you find it with Alex Jones, you find it with Ann Coulter, and percolating up into nincompoop level with the current president of the United States. The Russian Revolution period is an even more illustrative of the way that politics and science bump into each other in really scary, frustrating ways. Because there were physicists who were devout Christians who couldn't stand Einstein because he was associated with the Bolsheviki of science that were trying to overturn everything. And you have the fact that now you had a group of scientists doing science work in the new Soviet Union that now, did you want to not do science with them because they were the wrong political system? Toss in the Nazis and the new regime, where they were deciding that, with our picture of Albert Einstein in our guest here in the room, that Jew science was not German science and it couldn't possibly be true. To this day, there is a big uncertainty debate, ironic, with Werner Heisenberg as to how much of a foot dragger he was on the German atomic bomb program. And I lean towards the idea that Heisenberg knew that Einstein was right. He knew that the science was real. He knew that he was working for a regime that was really nasty. And he managed to make a lot of convenient mistakes in their atomic bomb program. Oops, I'm sorry that we did that. The whole laboratory blew up. Oops, oh me, oh my. Well, we'll start again. Give us some more marks. We'll pick up where we left off. So my suspicion is that there's a good case to be made that Heisenberg managed to kind of dilly-dally and dawdle. But the bigger picture, of course, is that Einstein isn't Jew science. It was just science. And the idea that you would disagree with the findings of a phenomenon because you didn't like the fact that it didn't match what you wanted to be true, that is the antithesis of the scientific method. And just to make sure that it wasn't just Nazis doing this, over in the Soviet Union, they had their own little hobby horses. Who are familiar with Lysenko, the guy who was this little Politburo jerk who got put in place of the entire genetic system and agricultural system in the Soviet Union all the way down into the 1960s. I don't think he was ousted until well into the Khrushchev years. He managed, well, you see, Western-style genetics was deemed to be anti-proletarian, that there was a true socialist genetics, that because they believed that environment was everything, that you could raise a whole new crop of people where there would be no religion because they didn't teach it, and everything is purely environmentally based, and there would be no homosexuality because homosexuality was a product of capitalism, and in the socialist utopia there would be no need for that, and everything was going to be sweetness and light and wonderful. And no, didn't turn out that way. The geneticists began to have problems, and this was particularly awkward for a lot of the left-wing Haldane, and a lot of them were very leftist in the 1930s, and they were having awkward times dealing with the increasingly pseudoscientific nature of what was going on in the Soviet Union. Some of them accommodated themselves to it, and others didn't. Somebody like Bertrand Russell, if you want to look at from these culture camp issues, he could never wrap his brain around the fact that he had a gay kid. And so you have a lot of social issues that are popping up in unusual contexts. You want to find somebody who is as fuddy-duddy conservative as you can get on marriage issues. Look at Richard Lewontin, the leftist biologist that helped develop punctuated the spandrel concept with Stephen Jay Gould. He's an orthodox communist to this day. And you're going, wow, how absolutely astonishing. But he too falls in the line that the ideology tells him about marriage relationships in the same way that the conservative Tony Perkins branch of religion has views of marriage that they regard doctrinally as true. So there's no way that you can maneuver around, because it's done by people, is going to be part of the politics and culture of the times they live in. And they can use religion and science as proxy wars for things that they regard as fighting words. And we're seeing that, as I pointed out in the climate change issue. It's certainly been the case with evolution for a long time. But because young Earth creationism tramples across almost all of knowledge, to the extent that they're out there, this affects history. The idea about when the Egyptians lived is something that actually conflicts with young Earth creationist dogma. And so it's hard to imagine a field of inquiry where these methodological issues aren't actually showing up. I shall pause for breath here and take a look at what was going on over in the live chat to see some comments on there. I'll skip past Paranormal's wire coat hangers. Ann Coulter is solidly a nincompoop level. Oh yeah, I go into that. The Aristotelian burger, if I'm mispronouncing your name, Charis, or I will just call you the burger lady,
Karis.
Because that's wonderful. But anyway,
Charis.
Karis. I apologize because I'm terrible on names, and I'm going to want to give that a hard CH in there. AJS says war is good for business. I'm not sure if a hobby horse would apply. I'll get into that. Oh, you were about to say something?
Yeah, I'm terrible with names too, but I happen to know her a little bit, so that's why I remember this one.
Yeah, it takes me a while for that, and especially because I'm a clumsy oaf and I see things. Remember the first time I ever bumped into somebody when I talked about Goethe, but I never heard the name pronounced, and I called him Goethe, and I got whooped upside the head on that, you know, and I never made that mistake ever again. So, but the war is good for business thing, that's where you get into legitimate issues about once you have an economic vested interest in something and the ability to tinker with the political power. It's still an open question how good war is for business. It may be good for certain businesses, obviously, if you make tanks and ammunition and things like that. But it's still genuinely an undecided question whether science and technology benefits from war or not. We know it does do certain jump starts. It's a fair thing to say that competition is good for it. And to the extent that war forces you desperately to competitiveness, where where literally your life depends on you building a better airplane than your opponent, that produces a selection pressure for certain technological advancement. But we know that there was technological advancement in the peacetime years in a variety of ways. We know that our modern computer technology was dependent on the integrated circuit that was developed based on science that was done in the 1900s at a time of European peace, and then jump-started not by the Second World War, but by the Russian space race issue, where they had to make extremely compact devices. So there again, there's that political competition thing. The idea that you should have wars, there's a line in one of my favorite science fiction movies that I recommend everybody see, the old H.G. Wells' Things to Come, where the fellow in there, this was written in 1935, says, war is stimulative, it's a stimulant. And the John Cabal character says, yeah, but you can overdo a stimulant. And so overall, when you think of the number of people that are killed in wars, when you think of the amount of wastage on frittering away efforts on side issue things, that I am more on the side that a peaceful, competitive society will make far more advances than ones that spends too much of its time blowing each other up. Anyone want to throw in comments on that? Jump in. Dead silence. Stephen Bauman over in the the chat thing
was muted. Just, not so
yeah,
far.
I just come in, because as much as I love to hear myself speak, I'd like to get feedback. So the idea that war is not necessarily that great of a stimulant in the long run. Pro or con?
Sorry, I have to juggle between two things because I had an earlier appointment who just blocked it. And so I was talking to him on one computer and not quite listening. Can you repeat the question?
Multitasking.
Yeah.
I was a commentator in the pile. AJS said war is good for business as a prospect. And I was saying that from my study of the thing, my take would be, yes, it can spur on some technological development because it acts as a necessary stimulus. You have to build a better airplane. You have to figure out how to build a bomb. You have to be able to do this. And so a lot of technology will develop that way. But that it also has such a high downside in terms of the number of people who might invent clever things getting dead, and also the enormous wastage of building things that aren't really a long-term productive things, whether they're tanks, whether they're walls and concrete bunkers and all of that, that I suspect that in the long run, competitive structure is better for science and technology than a wartime one.
I was having this conversation with a friend earlier this evening. For me, it's night now, but I was out for the evening. We were talking about this. I think it might spur on things, but on the other hand, I think that if we were to put the money that we put into wars, if we put that into science directly,
yeah,
it would have taken us a little bit further than we're at the moment. And we were, just to clarify, we were discussing the Second World War. So
yeah. Well, even today, I mean, look at it's $500 billion defense budget and tossing everybody else. It's fair to say that we're spending easily $750 billion a year on the planet for military enterprises. Even 10% of that done collectively for a robust space exploration program could have brought us with man landing on Mars, permanent bases on the moon, a telescope on the far side of the moon that would be able to give us views without all of the electromagnetic stuff. So a radio telescope there would be able to see great things of deep space without the vibrations from the Earth bumping in. And so many of these things, I can't imagine we would not be making better progress on a lot of fronts if we had that as our driver. I'll then put it up as the stand that war is not really a good idea.
Well, I really think the U.S. is an outlier when it comes to what you're asking, because when you look at a normal war, I normally agree with with what they say, that it can stimulate an economy. Well, for the winners, that's part of why I don't really like that saying, because for the losers, not so much. I mean, it's terribly selective, but I don't think the U.S. is somebody that we should look to rather, to really support or deny this comment. We're not really, we're kind of outside the range of normal. We don't really fight wars. We just go and occupy.
Oh, well, we have to isolate the things when you have major wars. The Great World War of the 20th century, which was in two parts: World War Part One, and then a 20-year armistice, and then World War Part Two. If you think of it in terms of the geopolitical things that were being thrown up, and it's as one giant conflagration. But the problem is all the people that died during it. World War I decimated the European population to where so many of the best and brightest, we have no idea what they would have come up with. What music, what art, what science, what invention, what physics, what mathematics would have been done by all of the people that were obliterated in there and never had a chance to do anything because they're choking on gas in a trench on the Somme.
This is why I say it's limited to the winners.
Yeah. And so, but it's ironic that it wasn't even limited to the winners, because the winners came out of it weaker than they would have been otherwise. The big question that I was hoping that we would be able to be getting into more in the 21st century, but apparently we got to replay the 20th century again. And here's where the history lessons come in, is some of the same bad roads that we went down in the 1920s and the 1930s. We had a series of xenophobic ideologies that were coming in, whether it was communism in the Soviet Union, whether it was fascism that started out in Italy with Mussolini in the 1920s, and then you got Nazism in Germany. None of these ideas came out of the middle of nowhere. Marxism had been an idea that had been thrown around since the mid-19th century. A lot of the things that led to the Third Reich were arguments that were going on in German culture. I made a point of making a mention in the notes to the video. Fritz Stern's The Politics of Cultural Despair. It's an old book from the 1960s. Probably most college and major city libraries will still have it. And if you can get it, please read it, because it goes into the Führer principle and the kind of German chip on their shoulder, it can never be our fault mentality. There's a whole bunch of ideas about a distrust of democracy, a need to have somebody tell you what to do, that play out horribly. The economic system collapses in the 1930s, and that's when the Germans, the Nazis, sweep into power. That's another reason why you don't want economic collapse. Curtail trade. You don't want trade wars. We've been down this road before in history. It's a bad idea. International trade can be bumpy. It always is. But the alternative, world wars and catastrophes, are way worse. And I think if you don't understand that trend of history and realize that people just historically are less likely to shoot at people that they are trading with freely. And if you forget that, you forget that at your peril. We have, unfortunately, an administration that is the most historically illiterate and scientifically illiterate ever. I mean, ever. This is including Harding, Nixon, Buchanan, Pierce. These are lofty intellects by comparison to the gang that are currently in the administration. And this is scary shit. And if it were just Donald Trump in Trumplandia, you've got Erdogan in Turkey that's pulling back the secularism of Turkey that's part of NATO. You've got Putin and his revival of a kind of neo-czarist state to make Russia great again. You've got all the traditional little nimrods knocking around in the corner, like in Venezuela and Zimbabwe and other areas, but those occur often in any context. But if you have major groups operating in pivot zones, those things can add up over time. And the kind of train wreck that took place in 1939 didn't happen overnight. It had decades of windup, and I'm fearful that we're seeing some of the same trends going on now, and we've got to work to not repeat those mistakes and not make fresh mistakes either.
I think part of the problem, I think, is that what you're calling mistakes, and most decent people would agree with you, people like, say, Trump's father, they would consider that not a flaw, but a feature. In his eyes.
Oh yeah, his dad was a kind of baby eugenicist. He was flirting with the KKK. The idea that, oddly enough, is a very Roman attitude, that to be poor is to be inferior, that to be rich is to be successful. And if you are rich and successful, it's because you're genetically superior. That was the kind of the trope that Daddy gave, and it's still one that kind of percolates through what passes for thought in Donald Trump's Geist. And then he surrounds himself with people like Steve Bannon, looks like Aleister Crowley crisscrossed with, I'm not entirely sure, Hermann Goering, and that he's starting to decay as we speak. The picture of Dorian Gray, it's a weird amalgam of stuff. And then, of course, Steve Miller, that little angry troll. You've got people that are all too reflective of the kind of pseudo-intellectuals that were circulating around the Nazi Party, circulating into that structure in the 1920s and 30s. We thought we'd kind of weeded that kind of stuff out, but remember, Tortugan dumb is a continual thing you've got to fight against. The human beings produce dumb ideas as well as clever ideas just naturally. There's a natural mix. What you need are social institutions that dampen down the ill effects of those. And what happened, there was frankly a giant malfunction in the GOP. The Republican Party tended, even with its increasingly Coulter camp character, to kind of weed out the extreme wingnuts. But there were so many little Coulter camp candidates this time around that Trump was able to come in and steamroller over them and get the nomination and then hijack the system. So it's a serious soul-searching moment as to how our political systems are judged, how grassroots participation plays a case. We have way too few people voting in primary elections. We have way too few people voting in off-year elections. And that allows things like this to build up. I'd love to see the 100 million mark.
Doesn't
Yeah,
it
jump in.
doesn't it also count that Trump got this election by being a populist, by changing his opinion sometimes 3 times a day just to satisfy the people that he had in front of him at the moment? Because that's something we have a politician like that here in Holland, and I still think that's the only way he gets votes, because like Trump, they both don't have solutions. They only have criticism of what's going on at the moment, of other parties, of other policies, and they don't come up with any credible solution. And I could be that I missed it, but the media here in Holland is quite accurate, and I haven't seen anything come from Trump or the Trump administration that to me sounds as a solid idea to get to make things better in the US, since they were the ones throwing out "Make America Great Again." I haven't seen one single plan. that he has.
I'll do a dissection on the demographics of things. Let me just jump in. Milan Graphilis points out, check out the Republican Party platform from 1912 or 1952 if you want to see how much the party has changed. That's a good historical point. 1912 would be when, even more so than the Republican platform, the Bull Moose platform of Teddy Roosevelt, it would be regarded as socialist by modern day standards. It was for an income tax. It was for a whole bunch of 8-hour days and work things at a very air quotes socialist for 1912 and largely accepted. 1952 wasn't a platform that would be recognizable in a lot of the culture camp today. And that word, the culture camp, has annoyed some culture campers because I insist on using it. I borrowed it from Bismarck, his culture struggle with the Catholic Church over parochial education. But it sums up in a nice single phrase the kind of mindset of block of Trump supporters. That Trump has, to some extent, disaffected people. There were people who voted for Obama, black conservative Christians who went for Obama and then went for Trump next time around. And some of it is disaffected people in states that had gotten bypassed in globalization. There were legitimate arguments going on, but a huge block of his voters are the culture camp anti-evolutionist bloc that's represented by Tony Perkins and the Family Research Council, Jay Sekulow and Pat Robertson. It's no coincidence that Jay Sekulow is now the lawyer to the president. That bloc found Trump utterly ideal because they got Mike Pence as a vice president, and Trump was saying the kinds of tropes about the gun lobby and about religious freedom and immigrants that played into, and climate change and other things, that played into the things they wanted to be true. So now that he's president, absolutely deliriously happy with him. And the idea that so long as he stays out of their way and never bucks any of the culture camp agenda, they'll be for him 100%. So if you look at the Ann Coulter frame, she's a culture camp conservative, and Alex Jones is kind of in the wingnut thing, but he is also part of this weird populist framework that he can be tied in on. They're a strong demographic that will vote. Boy, will they vote. If he got 62 million votes in 2016, he'll get at least 62 million in 2020. And so it's a matter that that's why the voter turnout thing, you need to swamp in not only the popular vote, but we know the Electoral College. You got to swamp it in states where he was able to win before, sometimes narrowly. And that means voter turnout has got to get up. The idea that you can have elections where only 40% of the registered voters actually end up voting. This is in addition to the difficulties that in some states they have for restricting voters and intimidating and having unusual hours for things. And there's a whole side issue on that, particularly in states with a lot of black voters and Hispanics that are serious issues that need to be addressed. But even it's just plain voter turnout. There's still more than enough votes out there to be able to swamp a lot of these elections.
Interrupt? Just to clarify something, because I know, and Karis is fairly new in things like this. You'll have to explain to Karis how she can jump in, because I don't think that she's aware that you tend to talk a little bit longer than
yeah,
others.
believe me, yes, Karis, it is absolutely fine to jump in and say, shut up, Jim, I want to say something. And I will never take offense.
That's
hey, Karis,
really not in my nature.
What
well,
did I just
okay,
what did I just send you in DM, Karis? Tell.
You sent me a DM, which I don't usually say live.
No, but I did use the exact same words, didn't I?
You did.
Okay, but you can just jump in.
Yeah, it's
James,
really okay. I really do mean it, because I know I can talk and fill, and as people have noticed, I breathe through my nose, so I can talk and breathe simultaneously, which just scares the shit out of people. But nevertheless, I managed to do that. Intend that we're living in really perilous times, and we're fortunately early enough. There's things about Trump that actually can be positive in a weird, frightening sort of way. Nixon never managed to so taint the imperial presidency that they stopped doing it. And Trump actually may do that. We may actually have much more congressional oversight. I'd love to see the thing where they actually reinstitute the idea that if we're going to go to war with a country, we don't just hand it over to the president to do with the War Powers Act. We actually make a damn declaration of war, that we take our responsibilities under the Constitution seriously. Plus, it's going to also mean, as Governor Moonbeam over in California has pointed out, that it doesn't matter that President Trump has pulled out of the Paris Accords. A lot of the states and businesses are going to just do it anyway. The president no longer will have the kind of imperial imprimatur. We don't care what he thinks. We're going to do our stuff anyway, and that's a federalism thing. There's going to be courts, there's going to be state houses, there's going to be all the different states doing their thing, and the president can put out his stupid little tweets and never mind. So this actually may have a positive benefit. There's another factor where the comments came up with a bunch about welcome to the fact that we're no longer the imperial empire of the economy. This is something that people should have recognized a long time ago. The United States is a huge economic powerhouse, but it's only a small portion of the world's population. And as the world industrializes, I was seeing this back in the 1980s. I was looking forward into the future, and I'm thinking, wait a minute. You've got 1 billion Chinese, you've got people all over the world, they're starting to industrialize, build things on their own, figure out how to do industry. They're going to bypass a lot of the problems we did by coming up with cleaner industries directly. The time will come when America is going to be marginalized in the world economy. We're not the big player on the block. And so the idea that this was something that was going to be kept in a box somewhere, no, heck almighty. You want to see why Buick is, yeah, jump in.
I think there's another thing. You just mentioned Buick, but I was into cars all of my life, and when I grew up, the American cars were top of the line. They were the best you could get. They were they didn't break. They lasted a long time, and they were top of the line. They had the best accessories. Those were the most modern cars you could buy here. And that stopped at some point. When the Japanese began to make cars, they overtook the US in having the best cars, in having the most modern cars, and in changing how the models looked. They were keen on cars that were made in a wind tunnel, cars that were cheap.
Yeah.
And what I'm thinking is that the American industry just ran behind at some point, and that has cost them dearly. And that's not only when it comes to cars, but
who came up with the kind of systems the Japanese adopted. He couldn't sell it to the American industry. The kind of quality control systems that were being developed. And my mom even noticed, because she was always a Chrysler a car fan, and she discovered over the years how Chrysler's product lines were getting less and less. The old Walter P. Chrysler era had changed by the time you were hitting the 1960s and 1970s, and so they were losing their edge. And the flabby car designs, the lack of fuel efficiency and all the rest, and they pay very little attention to that little oddball bunch over in Japan that were building these little small efficient cars. Well, we've seen this again with the Koreans. Boy, nothing jump-started the American car industry and the Japanese car industry more than Kia, which started out making absolute crap, but they had a learning curve that was really fast. And within a very short period of time, they jump-started to where now they thought, you know, we can offer cars that look like Mercedes-Benzes and with standard equipment that can jump past everybody. It's forced everybody to catch up. And cars today have standard equipment features that would have been considered the height of luxury 15 years ago because of that constant competition between the Americans and the Japanese and the Koreans and whoever else comes down the line. Now Tesla's throwing the thing into the thing. And it's because competition is good. That it means that the consumer decides what is the clever thing, and they go for it, and you're not based on the fact that you have just a single product line that you're forced to buy. The reason why I brought up Buick is the reason why there's Buick and not Oldsmobile and Pontiac. Were both junked. That's because Buick is the highest selling car in China. The black Buicks, they're a status symbol. So they were never going to stop that. And well, I think one of the reasons why Buicks are a car that they like a lot in China is because they're not Japanese. Because an awful lot of Chinese will remember the fact that they had an unpleasant interaction with the Japanese not that long ago. And so they would rather prefer not to buy a Japanese product, no matter how good of its quality, or even in foreign, and they can go with the American Buick. And we'll be playing on that for a while. Competition is good, and I was pointing out to Jackson, who, when he was in here before and had to skip out because now he's moving furniture and things, and they're eating food. You know, this need to eat, it happens in vertebrates. But I was pointing out that oh gosh, I think I just had a brain fart and forgot the train of thought I was about to mention. Yep, it's gone. Boop. Oh boy. Yeah.
That happens when you go from cars to vertebrates.
Yeah, yes, cars to vertebrates, which oddly enough, I actually use an example, the Slam Dunk book and in the Troubles in Paradise, about the automobile design and the relation there. I wish I could think of what, it was an awfully good analogy I was going to be making, but unfortunately it's completely disappeared. Oh, well. Yeah, I was talking with Jackson about, yeah, it's just completely gone. My apologies, folk, it happens.
Okay, but it's not only the car industry. It's, I think, across the line, where everything ran behind. It's in electronics, in everything, and I don't know if it's just me, but I've read somewhere that the U.S. the defense budget, the U.S. defense budget, is more than the world combined. And I don't.
Yeah, it's about, yeah, it's giant, and it's got even bigger under the spend money on it for no purpose Trump administration.
Yes.
Yeah, it's clumsy, but there's a long-term history about how businesses rise and fall. How many of you remember International Mercantile Marine?
How many of us? There are only two of us. Otherwise, in the conversation.
Well, there we go. Well, I can still point it out to people over in the thing. International Mercantile Marine was the huge conglomerate that J.P. Morgan assembled in the early 20th century to control all the shipping on the Atlantic Ocean. And he almost made it. And so when the Titanic sailed in 1912, it was one of the subsidiaries of International Mercantile Marine. The French line was International Mercantile Marine. Both of the German lines of North German Lloyd and Hapag were part of International Mercantile Marine. Where is International Mercantile Marine today? Well, partly because of that iceberg that upset White Star and a few other things. He could never get Cunard, by the way, because Cunard had made a deal with the devil, with the British government. And in trying to make ships that were really super fast to get the blue ribbon and beat the socks off of the damned competitors, they decided to make a secret deal with the British government where they could get turbine engines, 4 engines on each one of their new ships, the Lusitania, the Mauretania, and the Aquitania, that would be paid for by government subsidy. Because those turbine engines were expensive. Titanic had only one in the middle, and the same with the Olympic, because they were so expensive. That enabled these new Greyhounds of the sea to go at like 24 knots, and there's nothing that could keep up with them. The deal was they had to be used as auxiliary cruisers in wartime. So there were big rings that were mounted for gun platforms that the guns could be put on any of those ships. They were never used, as it turned out, in wartime, but nevertheless, it was part of the deal. And part of the deal with the government was no foreign power could ever own a Cunard line. So they couldn't sell out to International Mercantile Marine, even if they wanted to, because of the fact that they had a secret contract with the British government. So there is some of the little side issues that how what we see as an iceberg ship issue relates to geopolitics and the run-up to World War I and a whole bunch of side issues that is always more to the story.
Okay, and I'm looking at the chat now, and I see Kara's posting something. She said she knows more of the religious aspect in all of this, and seeing that's my shtick on Twitter and on YouTube, I'd like to have some of that thrown in. Can you enlighten us a little bit, Karis?
It's a little bit broad. I would need some specific point to launch off of.
Well, what we were addressing earlier, the fact that America is lacking on so many points. Do you think that religion had a part of it as well?
No, not at all.
Okay.
I'm kidding. Yes.
I'll put this, the interesting question, Pelagia and others brought up stuff about Roman aqueducts and ancient Greek and Roman science. That's another fascinating area that I'd studied quite a bit. The Greek and Roman science had kind of an applied technology aspect, but there was always a cultural break on it. The aqueducts were necessary to bring water into the cities so that they could maintain the public structure and make sure that the slaves didn't revolt. Jump in.
Can I be rude? I was asking Karis about the religious aspect. So now we're drifting off again. I really
okay.
want.
Well, I said, Karis, please.
I didn't want to interrupt about your aqueducts, and I was trying to think of a really creative way to insert religion into your aqueducts. Okay, no, I'm kidding. So, I guess the elephant that I'd like to throw in here is a end times theology in with this U.S. war complex, and also Israel and the Middle East.
That is very good. Yes, that's a relevant point because, and especially now with this particular administration and the nexus around in that. The closest we got to it before was James Watt, who was the Secretary of the Interior under Ronald Reagan, if memory serves me, who was saying that he really didn't feel the need to be that protective of the national parks because the end times were soon and there was going to be an entirely new earth made. And people were going, what? What? And so he kind of lost his job over that in the Reagan years, and nobody ever went quite that so far again. But you do have a group of people, the Pat Robertson worldview is expecting kind of an imminent second coming and an Armageddon. And that, I believe, is the worldview of Jay Sekulow, who is currently the lawyer to the President of the United States. And you've got a little bit of this eschatological chess match going on between Palestinians and Jews and how American Christians of the culture camp conservative framework connect up to that. And this is like a powder keg where you have people who have basically a Ben Carson medievalist mindset are going to be making decisions relating to settlement policies in Israel, wading to water issues, wading into weapons sales, and what could go wrong? Yeah, a lot.
KKK members telling Jews that they will not be replaced by Jews. Meanwhile, probably harboring some very fundamentalist scatological beliefs, which would be rather Jew dominant. I don't understand. Yeah. I don't get it. I mean, I do get it.
Well, when you're down in the grassroots, and this is where we know the example from the Nazis to see the kind of roots of their weirdness. They were just had a whole bunch of ones. Himmler in particular was a real nutball when it came to all what we would consider fringe pseudoscience stuff. The idea that the Welteisslehre theory, the world ice theory, and the whole bunch of other stuff. He was the guy running around like Indiana Jones, hunting up Holy Grail stuff and that in this kind of pseudo mythology that he believed in. Hitler could care less. He was a utilitarian type and had to constantly saying, you know, stop, kill Jews the way you're supposed to. Forget all this crap about magic swords. But you find that these weird pseudoscience viewpoints are also popping up in a weird mixture with the ones. It's no coincidence that some of the oddball flat earthers are kind of anti-Semites. You still find, if you look to see who pushes the protocols of the elders of Zion mythology about the Jews, that pops up in fringe creationism literature. And so this stuff, it's not material that percolates up at the higher echelon. You're not going to see this at Tony Perkins land. You're not going to see this popping up in the people that are in the Trump administration. But farther down at the grassroots level, you've got this weird cross-connectional bouillabaisse of people who are used to looking at stuff on the internet now. In the old days, they would have seen the little pamphlet that the nutball brings home from the meeting that they attended to down in the park. Now they do
Could
it
I
all
point out one
online.
person?
And so there's a strange synergy that has always been there in fringe pseudoscience beliefs, but it's got a new leg. And to some extent, we have the advantage that these numbskulls post online. They go on Twitter, they put up bloody websites. And so if you want to track, you actually have a better way of doing it today than you did in the old days.
Well, I think unfortunately you may be slightly incorrect on one thing. One thing that has changed from the old days is that these views that you're saying do not percolate to the upper echelons of our government are indeed percolating to the upper echelons of our government. For instance, Mike Pence. He's the first one who comes to mind. And he's
he is a standard culture camper. That's why I'm far more frightened of him than Donald Trump. And I say, excuse me, you don't want to impeach Donald Trump. You now have President Pence. He is a full-blown culture camp and a creepy, dissembling, weird one who believed in gay, and I suspect still does, gay reparative therapy. Yeah, that he connects up with. Here, I suppose I should put in a big thing about why better information monitoring network of these sorts of things, because reporters often don't ask these people questions early on in their political career, so we don't really know a lot of the viewpoints. Once in a while, evolution or science issues will pop up, and you'll get a kind of a boilerplate thing. Pence gave a boilerplate quasi-intelligent design statement in Congress a while back when he was in Congress. But what you need is to have proper on these things, not just by annoying people like us, but also at the reporter level and in the political debate level, to where nobody who gets into political office can get into political office, at least without coming clean about the kinds of methods, the kinds of sources that they've relied on, how they fact check things or not. And we're nowhere near that kind of a vetting network that's done publicly and openly and honestly. And we need it, I think.
But isn't that a problem? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just saying that the idea that these sorts of thoughts, this sort of theology that we're talking about, the idea that this does not percolate to the upper echelons of our society and government, that may have been true in the 60s, 70s, 80s, perhaps even the 90s, but today we're going to have to put that feeling of security aside, because it's only a false security, because now we have people like Pence, we have people like Michelle Bachmann, we have people like Sarah Palin, and it's
I agree with you completely. That's why I was saying that the Trump administration is the most culture camp friendly administration ever. And by that, I mean that hyper-conservative, one of the ones, Melingis Felis says, Pence is, if not an actual dominionist, damn close to one. That dominionist notion that there's a godly dominion in political terms, that there's the traditional Bible viewpoint that needs to be the law of the land for everybody. That this is, yes, pervasive. If you look at the cross connections of people in these various conventions and things that they do all around the country, from the Family Research Council and Dobson's family group, and the Pat Robertson wing, and there's a fellow here named Chuck Misler who connects up with a lot of these things. And it even pops up with somebody like Pat Sajak, who is on the board of a lot of these culture camp religious organizations and these political groups, and he's the guy that spins the wheel there on the Wheel of Fortune. That there's a weird cross connection of stuff that's going on there, and I would agree with that. That's why the Trump administration, very much so, not merely because of Trump personally, but my knowledge about how he was coddling the various culture camp organizations, that was going to be an area. The moment he named Pence as vice president, and then when you saw the people that were being named in a lot of his cabinet, it's part culture camp hyper-conservative, and the rest are all military people. That's the entire Trump administration right there.
But
well, there's,
isn't the
God, I did it again.
Yeah,
It was
both of
your
you can't
it was
interrupt at once.
it,
That's my job.
it was your topic, Karis. You go first.
I forgot. Oh, right. Now I remember what I was going to say. See, I'm not immune to getting old.
You're
Uh,
not.
so one thing that people kind of forget about the fundamentalist spheres, the ones who are really interested in eschatology, the second coming of Christ, Armageddon, etc., they believe the timeline is continuing to move. We are continuing to move farther and farther towards the second coming of Christ, and any pushback they receive will be marks for them in heaven as far as persecution goes. So they're more likely, as they perceive the time, in quotes, the time is drawing nigh, as they perceive the time drawing more and more nigh, they'll become more and more brazen because they want those points for persecution. And that's going to really, we're going to be seeing more and more just brazen shows of stupidity, brazen shows of how many tiki torches could I store up in my garage for my friends. I mean, everything is going to become ridiculous as these people want to put more and more notches on their belts. As the scriptures say, those who, the ones who are involved in evangelism, they're said to have beautiful feet. They'll shine like stars in the universe. And they want that. That's an eternal, glorious reward that they want in heaven. And they really want to fight to get that.
And there's another thing I'd like to address, because I've seen that. I think from Ken Ham and from Kent Hovind and the likes of that it isn't necessary to get more things developed, to get better in science, to find out more, because this world isn't going to stay as it is, and there's going to be a second coming. So there's no need to go to anything when it comes to preservation, to when it comes to a climate control, to when it comes to the environment.
Yeah, it's that James
There's
Watt
there's no
attitude.
need there's no need to think of that, because this is just a matter of time before it all ends. And I wonder if that's something that, if you have high religious people in higher offices, if that doesn't ring through in any sort of way.
Yeah, the problem is, and this is the reason why that kind of methods questions issues are not moot, is that we don't know nearly enough about the various people that are in political office, not just in the Trump administration, in state houses and others. We just get little tips of the iceberg that pop up every once in a while when you see kinds of loose hand comments that are made. You theoretically could map all of the various politicians on a spectrum if you would get questions, and that they would have to be honest, the answers on them. And the fact that the reporting community doesn't really think about these kind of questions. We've had a reluctance to allow religion questions. It kind of came up backhandedly during Mitt Romney's run, because he's a Mormon. And I would say that the Mormon theology is not the issue. But if you believe that the Book of Mormon is historically accurate, that tells you that you have a big blind spot when it comes to history. You might be not all that good on dealing with other issues. So that's why you've got these third rails. This is, as we near the end of the hour, I can kind of pull the circle around, that you've never been able to escape the point that people that do science or not, the people that do politician activities or not, all of the different things that we do as a culture is inextricably linked with the attitudes we have, the religions we do or do not have, the science we do or do not do, our conceptions of history, what sources we rely on, what we don't. It's always been that way. And the core issues to maintain a secular progressive society is that you've got to know where people stand openly so people can make open decisions on it. And you have to have enough education and knowledge that the majority, when they vote, are voting for people who are not furthering a wackaloon agenda. I still at the moment think that most of the country does not have that viewpoint. But to the extent that too many of us don't get up and vote and don't do things and don't play a role in this, and that the media has let too many people go too long without things being clear, I would think one obvious question that should be just standard operating procedure from everybody is, how old do you think the Earth is? And that no one should ever take offense at it. And the only people who will be reluctant to say so are the ones who will not want to admit that they think it's only 6,000 years old. We haven't reached the kind of a stage where that becomes a standard question, and or people are kind of reluctant to make a mention of it.
I was just going to mention that other part. I mean, we're not the type of society that would, but you know, at large, that would really condemn somebody for thinking the age of the Earth is 6,000 years old, because our society is largely young Earth creationist to some degree, whether it's the 5,000 year, 10,000 year, what have you.
It's about 45% and has remained fairly constant, although the latest polling suggests that it started to drop among millennials. And whether this continues as a trend or not, we'll find out. But I use as a rough heuristic, roughly 45% of the American population. It's a different mix in other cultures, although there are a group of you have to remember, people tend to come in on these wackaloon ideas in times of stress. It was true of persecutions of witches. It's true of pogroms against the Jews. It's true of what was going on in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. They didn't gain power until the Great Depression hit. And suddenly you have everything falling apart. That's one of the reasons why economic crises and political crises, it's highly unlikely that the communists would ever take control of Russia had there not been World War I. And so the notion that extremists will take advantage of it is a good reason to try to do everything you can to prevent things from fraying at the edges. And the steps that were happening in Trumplandia are one baby step farther down the road of wackaloonery that is in the wrong direction. And we got to nip that in the bud in 2018 and 2020 and 2022 and on, and it's not going to be easy. And it's not a done deal. Imagine if the Republicans remain in control of Congress, or at least the Senate, in 2018, that is not a good thing. If Trump is reelected in 2020, imagine if Vice President Pence is then elected as president in 2024 and reelected in 2028. Good gravy. That is a whole generation of people who think that that's normal. And
Well,
I don't know that
tactic.
that won't happen.
Could take one tactic. Remember how the
Well,
Republicans flipped from liberal to conservative? Do it again.
There was not a flip. It was a slow process.
Okay, so it was a slow rollover. It was a flip. So it was a very fat flip.
It was the increasing marginalization of the gradual dying off of liberal Republicans, and I can remember liberal Republicans.
James, my point was they went from liberal to conservative. Just do it again.
They were always a mixed party. Neither one of the political parties were ever doctrinally rigid, except for relatively brief periods. The Democrats probably hit their most leftist thing in the McGovern era, and it's one of the reasons why they had terrible problems winning the presidency. And the Republicans, it's been a process that's accelerated since 1980s, early 1990s. So it's been about a generation, and it's been basically the shrinkage of the party into that culture camp base. What you might end up with is a complete realignment of political parties, because you've got kind of a split between the sort of libertarian economic conservatives versus the social conservatives, and that's the core of that culture camp frame. Typically, Americans don't like lots of political parties, and we basically focused on two that act as lightning rods, and sometimes they're negative parties. You had the Jacksonian Democrats in the 1820s and 30s, and the anti-Jacksonians that came to be called the Whig Party. But they were a weird, disparate group of Southern racists and Northern business people and a whole bunch of people, all of whom could agree on only one thing. They despised Andrew Jackson and what he stood for. And once that moved on, Then you went through a mutation where some of the people in the old Whig Party eventually bumped into and became the new Republican Party, which was an anti-slavery party, and then became the dominant one and continued in that mode afterwards. So it's a complicated thing. I don't know. I'm not enough of a psychic of politics to be able to see how political structures can work out, and whether or not we'll stick with the two existing parties, but we'll change the constituencies, or whether the hyper-conservatives will have to leave and there will be a revolt in the Republican Party and a reforming of a new GOP, or whether the labels will change, and what will happen with the Democrats, who are also in disarray. I don't know. And the only thing is that if whatever you call yourself, whatever labels end up, if the majority of people are in fact in favor of a legitimate, secular, free-loving society where everybody prospers and there is no trying to enforce orthodoxy through the means of government, I'm okay with it. What labels they stick onto it. And that's one of the reasons why I've been an opponent of the culture camp, and it's one of the reasons why I find Donald Trump so scary, because the guy doesn't believe a damn thing except himself, but he will pander to absolutely anybody. And the one that he's pandering to, because it got him elected, is that culture camp group that is latched onto him like a limpet. And we're in for tough times ahead. You think that it's just history of what went on in the 1920s and the 30s, where people had to make up serious decisions in their lives about who they were going to support and why and what they really stood for because the civilization was at stake. Well, buckaroos, we're kind of looking at that. Isn't that a cheery way to end an evolution hour?
We were looking at that in 2016. I mean,
yeah,
us millennials kind of went at each other's throats with the Democratic Party when it came to Bernie versus Hillary and then Hillary versus Trump. I mean, it was a bit of
and Trump played off of that. Remember, he came in second and squeaked through, and in fact, he came in as the squeaker in the nomination, because there were like 14, 15 different culture camp candidates. You had Rick Santorum and everybody else, and then of course Jeb, operating kind of off in the normal mainstream semi-conservative Republican branch. But none of them could gain any traction against this big fireworks display that told everybody wanted to do and fed off of bumper stickers. And the xenophobia, the policies, a lot of the policies, we're running over the hour, but I want to put this point out because it's relatively important, that I keep on reminding the Dinesh D'Souza's and the bunch about what the circumstance was for the people who lost the popular vote but got to be president because of the Electoral College before. And there were two times. Benjamin Harrison in 1888, this was the very first time. The 1876 disputed election is kind of a different thing. It was about Reconstruction and that, more complicated. But then in 2000 with George Bush. And something both of those have in common, other than the fact they're both Republicans. They were both people who screwed up the economy. Harrison managed to do it lickety-split fast in only one bloody term. And he had all the wrong policies. He was a protectionist, free silver advocate, inflation policy guy who the Republicans had all the wrong economic policies and managed to just tank the economy so fast that he got ousted in 1892 when poor Grover Cleveland got reelected, the only discontinuous president. But it didn't do him any good because the economy was so screwed up that the worst depression of the 19th century hit just as he was getting in office in 1893, and it tainted his entire term, and it kept the Democrats out of office for the rest of the century, and you didn't find a Democrat until the somewhat curiously problematic Woodrow Wilson pops in a disputed election in 1912 when he came in ahead of the other two Republicans that were duking it out, Taft and Roosevelt. So these little matters about the Electoral College and who votes and where and in what states, it matters how it matters. We can't afford to make these mistakes again. I don't know if there are 100 million votes that can be marshaled for a reasonable candidate in 2020, but I sure as hell would like to see that, because we can guarantee that those 62 million Trump voters are going to vote again because they're tenacious. They've got power now, and they're not going to want to give it up. Any final comments from the peanut gallery or the people in here that I've been stomping on, Karis and Pete, on the topics of the day?
Karis, you first.
No, I forgot what I was saying. Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Okay, well, I don't know whether or
I
not
have.
you want to have it.
Oh, wait,
Oh,
wait,
yes,
wait,
yes,
wait,
finish.
wait, wait. I'm
Yes,
still
yes,
here.
jump in.
I'm still here. Um, what I would like to say is I think the media in the U.S. needs to step up, and it needs to become a little bit more honest and a little bit less focused on getting certain people into office, and they should focus a little bit more on reporting the truth instead of reporting the things that people want to hear, because that's something that to me is a little bit staggering that that works the way it does in the US, and I don't think that's a good thing to have, and that's what also led to Trump, but it also led to what happened last weekend. It's because
Um,
they don't say what needs to be said.
well, over here in the United States, I would have to say that the media was not shy in reporting all the details on things. You have that well. The point is that the people who are the group that either liked the Nazis marching or wanted to not think about the Nazis marching because they love Donald Trump and they just think that's kind of a secondary issue. These are people who are not paying attention to those media. They're not paying attention to what's happening on PBS or the New York Times or the lying CNN as President Trump does. And so what you have in here is the thing that is probably the most insidious aspect of Trumplandia is its demonization of an independent press. Possible to have a functioning republic where the people cannot have an honest reportage, and the people who do the honest reportage are labeled lying press and fake news. And the thing that is the most insidious thing about Donald Trump is that here is somebody who is addicted to fake news and preposterous lies, and he is the one who is insisting on this. And the people who are supporting him, Dinesh D'Souza and that other representative, is of a mindset that ideologically driven news reporting, and only things that reinforce what they want to be true is what they will allow to be true. And that's where this methodology that I've determined in regards to creationism and what you see when you watch flat earthers, it's all the same bad method.
Okay,
and so
can I jump in again? I don't think you're watching the chat in here, because Karis is low on battery, so we might lose her anytime soon.
We got to pull the plug on this.
Yeah, is there anything, Karis, you wanted to bring in before you go?
Nope, I'm fine.
Okay.
Thank you for having me on. I don't think I really was able to contribute a whole lot, but it was an honor to be on.
Well, I like feedback, even if I have to nudge everybody to jump in and tell me to shut up every once in a while so they can get a word in. Thank you very much for listening all out in the internet land, and we'll see whether or not we want to go with some after show venue. We'll find that out. But anyway, stopping the broadcast now. Thank you very much for listening.